think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range.
She didn't want the crown. She never asked for it. She never campaigned for it, never whispered for it in darkened hallways, never positioned herself to receive it. And yet, the most powerful woman in the history of the British monarchy looked at every king, every prince, every blood-born heir standing before her, and she chose her anyway. This is the story of a secret that was never supposed to leave one room. A message written in quiet, careful handwriting by a dying queen, a truth so unexpected that when it was finally spoken aloud, it left two of the most powerful men in the world completely, utterly speechless. And the woman at the center of it all? She was sitting alone by a window that very same night, a cup of tea going cold beside her, completely unaware that upstairs her entire future was being rewritten. Most people thought they understood exactly how the British monarchy would unfold. First King Charles, then Prince William, then the generations that followed. Orderly, predictable, and wrapped in centuries of unbroken tradition. The line was clear, the path was set. Nobody questioned it, but what if someone had seen something different? What if long before the cracks began to show, one person had quietly looked at the future and understood something that nobody else was willing to say out loud? What if Queen Elizabeth II, in her final days, with steady hands and a mind still sharper than those around her, had already chosen who would truly save the crown? And what if she had trusted only one person to carry that message forward? That person was Princess Anne. Anne had always been the one who stayed. While others chased headlines and engineered their public image, Anne showed up, quietly, consistently, without applause. She was never the most glamorous figure in the family. She didn't need to be. What she had was something rarer than glamour. She had the Queen's trust, completely, unconditionally. And that trust came with a weight, because in the months before Queen Elizabeth passed, she had given Anne something she hadn't given anyone else. Not Charles, not William, not the palace advisors who hovered at her door. She had written something down, carefully, deliberately, in her own hand. And she had made sure Anne was the one who would hold it. Not a formal decree, not a legal document, something far more personal than that, a final wish. A private conviction about the future of everything she had devoted her life to building. And for a long time, Anne carried it alone. She read it, she sat with it, she wrestled with it in the quiet hours when the palace was still and the world outside continued on unaware. She asked herself whether it was her place to speak. She asked herself whether the time was right. She asked herself whether the people who needed to hear it were truly ready. And then one foggy London night, she decided they had to be. She called for Charles and William to meet her. No staff, no advisors, no palace officials, standing at the edge of the room with their polished shoes and careful faces. Just the three of them, behind a closed door in a room that smelled of old wood and older history. The room was serious in the way only very old rooms can be. Heavy curtains drawn against the night, dark portraits watching from the wall, kings and queens who had each, in their own time, faced a moment that defined everything that came after. Anne didn't make a speech. She didn't build to it slowly or soften it with preamble. She simply reached into what she had been holding, unfolded a letter worn soft from the number of times she had held it, and she placed it on the table between them. Charles picked it up first. His hands shook slightly. William leaned forward, his brow furrowed, reading every line twice as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more expected on the second reading. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked into the silence. Outside, London slept. The fog pressed gently against the windows, and in that room something shifted, slowly, irrevocably, like the ground moving beneath a house that has stood for centuries and is only now beginning to settle. The letter did not mention Charles as the answer. It did not point to William as the salvation of the monarchy. It pointed to someone else entirely, someone who had never once asked to be pointed to. Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Queen Elizabeth's words were not vague. They were not the sentimental musings of an old woman drifting toward sentiment. They were clear, considered, and deliberate. The words of someone who had spent 7 decades studying power and understanding, with a precision that no title alone could manufacture, exactly where it lived and exactly where it was needed. She had watched Catherine for years, not just at ceremonies and galas and carefully arranged public appearances, but in the quieter moments. The way she listened, the way she moved through rooms without needing them to reshape themselves around her, the way ordinary people who had never had reason to feel warmly toward the institution, softened when she was near. The Queen had seen something that charts and polls and palace strategy meetings couldn't quite capture. She had seen that the monarchy's future didn't rest on bloodlines or titles or the careful management of public perception. It rested on trust. And Catherine, without engineering it, without even fully realizing it, had become the person the public trusted most, not because she was born into it, because she had earned it. Charles broke the silence first. His voice, when it came, was strained, older somehow than it usually sounded. "This isn't how it's done," he said. And the words came out less like an argument and more like a man reasoning with himself, reaching for the familiar architecture of tradition, because the alternative was too large and too unfamiliar to hold comfortably. William said nothing for a long time. He sat with the letter still in his hands, his jaw tight, his fingers pressing and releasing against the paper. The emotions that moved across his face were not simple ones. This wasn't clean anger or clean grief. It was something more complicated. The feeling of looking at the whole story of your life and finding that one of the chapters had been written differently than you thought. Anne watched them both. She didn't rush them. She didn't argue or persuade or soften what she had placed before them. She had not come to fight. She had come because her mother had asked her to, and because deep in the part of herself that she trusted most, she already knew the letter was right. Catherine was different, not in a surface way, not in the way of image or charm or careful presentation, different in the way that mattered most. She made people believe in something they had slowly been losing faith in. She didn't restore the monarchy's image. She restored people's feeling about it, and there is no strategy in the world that manufactures that. When William finally spoke, his voice was low and unguarded in a way it rarely was. "Why didn't she tell us before?" Anne looked at him. There was no triumph in her expression. There was only the quiet sadness of someone who had been carrying a truth long enough to understand all the weight inside it. "Maybe," she said softly, "she didn't think you were ready to hear it." They sat together for a long time after that, 3 people breathing the same heavy air, each one holding a different piece of what it meant, what it would cost, what it would demand, what it would change. And meanwhile, in a different wing of the palace, the woman they were speaking about sat by a window with cooling tea and a restlessness she couldn't name. Catherine had just put her children to bed, George, Charlotte, and Louis, tucked in, kissed goodnight, doors pulled gently closed. Now she sat in the stillness, looking out at the fog drifting past the glass. She felt something that night, though she couldn't have said what it was, a strange quiet weight like the air before a storm. She didn't know that upstairs the course of her life was being decided. She didn't know that a queen who was no longer living had already looked at the future and seen her face in it. She only knew what she had always known, that there was work to be done tomorrow, people to show up for, a life of service that she had chosen and would keep on choosing, not because she was required to, but because somewhere along the way it had become simply who she was. The following morning arrived slowly over London, heavy skies, grey light stretching across the city like something reluctant to begin, but inside the palace something had already irrevocably begun. A private meeting of senior royals and trusted advisors was assembled, quickly, quietly, without the usual ritual of formal invitation. The room they gathered in was the kind of room where serious things were said and then never spoken of outside its walls. Princess Anne walked in first. She didn't look uncertain. She looked like someone who had made peace with a difficult decision and was now simply carrying it forward. In her hand, the leather folder, inside it, the letter that was already changing everything. Charles came next, wearing the expression of a man who had not slept well and was determined not to let anyone see it, and then William, upright, composed, every inch the prince he had been trained since birth to be, though if you looked at his eyes, something was burning there. something that training hadn't fully reached. Anne placed the folder on the table without ceremony. "This is Her Majesty's final wish," she said. "Not mine, not Charles's, not William's, hers." The room leaned in. The Queen's words moved through the assembled faces like something physical, shock, disbelief, a few faces that had been carefully neutral suddenly unable to hold that neutrality, because the message wasn't complicated, it wasn't hedged or diplomatic or open to interpretation. Catherine was not simply to support the next king, she was meant to stand as queen in her own right, a leader whose legitimacy came not from the accident of birth but from the quality of character, not inherited authority, earned authority, and in the Queen's estimation, there was no longer any question about which one the monarchy needed to survive. Charles's composure cracked. His hand came down on the table. "This is madness," he said, his voice shaking with something between anger and grief. "Succession cannot simply be rewritten." Anne met his eyes without flinching. "Mother wasn't confused," she said quietly. She was certain. And then William, the one whose entire life had been shaped around a destiny that was now being questioned, spoke in a voice stripped of everything performed. "What about me? What happens to everything I was raised to be?" Anne's face softened in the way it only ever softened for the people she truly loved. "You are still needed," she said. "You are still vital. But for the monarchy to survive, truly survive, not just endure, it must change." Mother saw that. She wanted us to see it too. William looked down. His hands were clenched in his lap. It felt in some place he couldn't fully name, like a betrayal. And yet even as he sat with that feeling, another thought moved quietly beneath it, a thought he didn't want to have but couldn't stop. He had watched Catherine walk into rooms full of grief and leave them somehow lighter. He had watched her sit with children in hospitals and make them laugh. He had watched the world, skeptical, guarded, exhausted by the endless theater of royal life, fall genuinely, helplessly in love with her. Not because she performed warmth, because she was warm. Not because she sought their affection, because she gave them hers first and asked for nothing in return. Maybe, he thought, and the bitterness of it sat alongside the truth of it. She had been the real heart of the monarchy all along. Outside the palace walls, nothing looked different. Ceremonies continued, photographs were taken. The choreography of royal life went on with its usual polished precision, but inside, a fault line had opened up that no amount of public relations could quietly fill back in, and the timing was not accidental because the monarchy had been bleeding trust long before this moment. Queen Elizabeth's death had exposed something that her presence had for decades quietly held together. The people's relationship with the institution had not simply been about tradition or patriotism. It had been, in large part, about her consistency, her dignity, her 60-year demonstration that service without self-interest was not only possible but sustainable. When she was gone, the question the institution had never been forced to answer directly suddenly hung in the air, unanswered. Why should we still care? Charles's reign was respected in the formal sense, the kind of respect that comes from position rather than from feeling. His past, the long and complicated road that had led him to the throne, was never far from the public's memory. He was the king, but he was not, for most people, the reason to believe in the monarchy. William was younger, more relatable, carrying the weight of a generation that wanted the institution to mean something beyond ceremony and inheritance. But the weight of expectation had a way of flattening a person under its pressure, making every movement careful, every word measured, every public moment so polished that the human being underneath became hard to see. And Harry, firing his grief and grievances from across an ocean, had left wounds in the family's public image that hadn't even begun to properly heal. The polls told the story plainly. Younger generations were not inheriting their parents' loyalty to the crown. In Australia, in the Caribbean, in parts of the Commonwealth that had long held their connection to Britain as something meaningful, voices were growing louder. The question wasn't just philosophical anymore, it was practical, it was urgent. The monarchy needed more than survival, it needed a reason to be loved again. Queen Elizabeth had understood this. She had seen it with the same clear, unsparing vision she had brought to every challenge of her reign. and she had quietly, without fanfare, without any announcement that would invite debate before she was ready, made her choice. She had chosen the one person who, simply by being herself, had already begun to answer the question nobody else knew how to answer. When people began looking more carefully at Catherine, some searching for flaws to justify their resistance to the Queen's wish, others searching for something to hold on to, what they found surprised them. They found a woman who had never waited for a title to define her sense of purpose. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton was born on the 9th of January 1982 at the Royal Berkshire Hospital in Reading. She didn't arrive into royalty or wealth or the kind of world where destiny is arranged in advance. Her father was a flight dispatcher. Her mother had worked as a flight attendant before building from nothing a small mail-order party supplies business that would grow into something real and sustaining. On her father's side, there were roots deep in British society, old connections, quiet dignities. On her mother's side, there were coal miners. Catherine grew up holding both of those things simultaneously, tradition and humility, aspiration and groundedness, and perhaps that unusual balance was what made her capable of belonging to a world as extraordinary as the one she eventually entered without ever losing herself inside it. As a child, she moved. Her family relocated to Jordan when she was 2, where her father worked for an airline. She attended an English-speaking nursery, already learning before she could fully articulate it that adaptability was not something to fear, but something to practice. By 4, back in England and enrolled in school, she was already showing the quiet self-possession that would define her, independent in her thinking, mature beyond what her years should have allowed. At Marlborough College, she became the person she was always going to be, captain of the field hockey team, recipient of the Gold Duke of Edinburgh Award, a distinction that required real stamina, real commitment, real willingness to push through discomfort without an audience watching or applauding. When she faced a minor health procedure during those years, she returned to her studies without drama, without seeking attention, without needing the moment to become a story about her. She took a gap year before university and used it fully. She went to Florence, studied art. She went to Chile with Raleigh International, volunteered on community projects, trekked through terrain that didn't make concessions for someone who wasn't serious about being there. She worked as a deckhand at Southampton. She was not building a resume, she was building herself. At the University of St. Andrews, she studied art history, organized charity events, worked part-time to help cover her own expenses, and in the ordinary, unscripted way that the most consequential things in life tend to happen, met a young man named William. They became friends first, then gradually something more. Their relationship grew quietly, away from the public eye for as long as they could manage it. When it was eventually exposed, first photographed together on a ski trip in Switzerland in 2004, the world took notice and the world did not let go. In 2007, under the relentless pressure of public scrutiny and the particular cruelty that media attention reserves for those who haven't asked for it, they separated briefly. Tabloids that had already spent years finding creative ways to diminish her, including a nickname so casually cruel, it said more about the culture that invented it than about her, expected her to fracture, to react, to become, in her pain, the story they had already written for her. She didn't. She stepped back. She got quieter. She got stronger. And when she and William found their way back to each other, she returned not smaller, but more fully herself than before. On the 29th of April 2011, watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world, Catherine Middleton married Prince William and became the Duchess of Cambridge. She stepped into one of the most scrutinized roles on the planet and did not waver. In the years that followed, she and William welcomed 3 children into the world. Prince George in 2013, Princess Charlotte in 2015, Prince Louis in 2018. Each birth was a moment of genuine public joy, not the manufactured kind that palace communications teams orchestrate, but the spontaneous kind that happens when people feel genuinely connected to someone they have come to love. Through it all, Catherine held the balance: mother, royal, public figure, charity advocate, human being. She held all of it, without letting any single one collapse the others. And the charity work, this was where people who had looked for the performative found something that stopped them. Long before she married into the royal family, Catherine was already giving. In 2007, when she was still simply a young woman navigating the unusual difficulty of being very publicly attached to a prince without yet having any official standing, she organized a photography exhibition to raise funds for UNICEF. She hosted a charity roller disco that raised £100,000 for children's hospital and mental health programs. The visits to hospices, the afternoons with sick children, these were not things that happened after she became the Duchess of Cambridge and needed to fill a public role. They happened before. They happened when there was no title attached to her name and no photographer waiting outside the door. They happened because they were simply what she did. After the wedding, she and William directed their wedding gifts, not toward themselves, not toward anything that would decorate their life, toward 26 charitable organizations. She donated 7 inches of her own hair to the Little Princess Trust, a charity that makes wigs for children undergoing cancer treatment. She made the decision privately. She didn't announce it. It became known only quietly, the way things do when they are not engineered to become known. Mental health advocacy became a defining thread running through everything she did publicly. At a time when the subject was still edged with stigma in many corners of British culture, she stood in front of cameras and spoke about it plainly. Not because it polled well, not because a communications team had identified it as a strategic priority, but because she believed that the platform she had been given was wasted if it wasn't used for something real. When this picture came into fuller focus, this woman who had quietly and consistently been more than anyone had required her to be, something shifted even among those who had initially resisted the Queen's wish. Not everyone was converted. There were those who held firmly to tradition, who argued that the line of succession was not a matter of personal merit but of constitutional order. There were those who raised practical concerns, experience, preparation, the particular demands of political leadership that no amount of natural grace fully substitutes for. These were not unreasonable arguments. They sat alongside the other truth, uncomfortable and irresolvable in the way that the most important truths tend to be. And William, sitting with all of it, found himself somewhere he had never expected to be, not in the place of a man who had been wronged or displaced, but in the place of a man reckoning honestly, perhaps for the first time, with what he had actually witnessed over years of standing beside her. He had seen her absorb the cruelty of the press without letting it harden her. He had seen her sit in rooms with grieving people and somehow make those rooms feel less alone. He had seen the public, not just the already devoted, but the skeptical, the indifferent, the quietly Republican, and look at her and soften. He had seen her protect their children from the machine of public life without ever letting that protection tip into resentment of the life itself. He had loved her for all of it, but perhaps until this moment he hadn't fully understood what he was loving. She had not become the heart of the monarchy because anyone had asked her to. She had simply been herself consistently and completely in a world that applied relentless pressure to be something else. And the heart had formed around her quietly, without announcement. When Catherine was finally made aware of the Queen's wish, and when the weight of what had been decided in that room was gently, carefully placed before her, the room waited. Some expected immediate acceptance, the natural culmination of a life that had been, seen from outside, a long preparation for exactly this. Some expected hesitation. The reasoned pause of a woman who understood responsibility and didn't reach for it carelessly. What they got was something neither camp had quite prepared for. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke in the clear, steady voice of someone who had thought deeply about something and arrived somewhere honest. She said that although it was the desire of many to lead, it was also the desire of every wife to keep peace within the family she loved, and therefore she needed time to think about it. Not yes, not no. Something more revealing than either. A woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating the tension between the public and the private, between duty and love, between what was asked of her and what she asked of herself, refusing, even now, to answer before she was certain. King Charles said nothing for a long moment. William looked at her with an expression that couldn't quite be named, and then, quietly, slowly, the beginning of something like understanding moved across his face, because in that single answer Catherine had done what she had always done. She had shown them exactly who she was, not a politician calculating outcomes, not an ambitious figure reaching for power, a woman, a mother, a person who took the weight of things seriously and refused to be careless with it. Queen Elizabeth had written her name in a private letter and trusted a single daughter to carry the message forward. She had looked at all the blood and tradition and ceremony that the monarchy was built upon, and then she had looked past it to the person quietly sitting at the center of it all, and she had seen the future. Not because Catherine had the right lineage, because she had the right heart. The monarchy the world thought it understood was already changing, not with a proclamation, not with a revolution, with something quieter and far more difficult to stop. The slow, unstoppable recognition of a truth that had been sitting in plain sight for years, waiting patiently to be seen. A queen had seen it first. A princess had carried it forward. And now, in a room where two powerful men had fallen speechless, a woman who had never once asked for the crown was holding the question of whether to wear it. She hadn't decided yet, but the fact that she was the one being asked, that alone said everything. What do you make of Catherine's response? How do you think William truly felt in that moment? And do you believe Queen Elizabeth made the right choice? Share your thoughts below. This is a conversation worth having.